Riley Shaw wasn't supposed to be here. Fort Brixton's range was for active-duty Marines, not civilians especially, not someone in plain work clothes with no insignia, blending in at the edge of the crowd. She looked like just another technician, the kind who fixes rifles for others but never fires them herself. But as she picked up the weapon, her grip and stance became clinically precise. Her breathing slowed, measured. The range officer watched, puzzled by movements that belonged on a different battlefield. Their laughter died as her sleeve slipped back, revealing the old seal trident tattoo. Silence followed, heavy and immediate, as the realization spread. At Fort Brixton's rifle range, visitors were rare, and civilians even rarer. The day's training session was unfolding as usual. Marines running through weapons checks and target drills, the steady rhythm of military routine. Then Riley Shaw appeared at the armory counter. She signed the logbook with a calm, practiced motion, her hands steady and her demeanor unremarkable. The paperwork listed her as a firearms technician from a local shop, just another civilian in plain work clothes and boots worn smooth by years of standing, not marching. The rangemaster barely glanced at her credentials, his eyes flicking over the sealed records and generic discharge paperwork that revealed nothing about her past. He handed her ear protection with a dismissive nod, moving on before she could say more. To him, she was just another outsider, someone whose presence didn't warrant a second thought. He didn't notice how Riley's gaze lingered on the Marines at the firing line, quietly assessing their grip and posture, her eyes catching the small inconsistencies in how they absorbed recoil or reset their stance. She blended in, but she saw everything. Riley made her way to an empty station, her movements unhurried and deliberate. She reached for an M4 carbine left on the bench, lifting it with an ease that seemed at odds with her civilian status. The motions were automatic. Practiced, she checked the chamber, adjusted the sling, and set the sights without hesitation. A corporal nearby paused, his casual interest shifting as he watched her hands work with an efficiency that didn't fit the usual profile of a visiting technician. The range safety officer, glancing over, offered a casual, "Knock yourself out," before calling the line hot. Riley brought the rifle to her shoulder, her cheek settling against the stock in one fluid motion. There were no last-minute corrections, no nervous glances at the controls. She exhaled, steady and even, and waited for the signal. As she fired, the sound of her shots cut through the usual chatter. Each round landed in tight, controlled groups, the rifle barely shifting in her grasp. Downrange, the target began to reveal a pattern of impossible accuracy, shot after shot passing through nearly the same point. The Marines nearby exchanged glances, their earlier indifference starting to give way to curiosity. A staff sergeant walking the line slowed as he watched her reload, noting the way her hands moved, no wasted motion, just quiet confidence shaped by experience. When Riley ejected the magazine, her sleeve snagged briefly, and the faded ink on her wrist was visible for a moment. The staff sergeant's expression changed, but he said nothing. Riley simply reacquired her target and resumed firing, her focus unbroken. The atmosphere on the range shifted, the easy banter replaced by a new sense of attention. Marines who had ignored her now found themselves watching, waiting for her next move, their own assumptions quietly unraveling as the reports of her shots echoed down the line. Her shots rang out in a methodical rhythm, no flinch, no wasted motion. The rifle remained steady against her shoulder, each trigger pull paired with a measured exhale. Riley's stance was deliberate, her breathing slow and controlled, the kind of composure that hinted at advanced training. Not a single movement was wasted, and the way she absorbed the rifle's recoil suggested years of experience beyond the surface of her civilian paperwork. Further down the line, a sergeant's conversation trailed off as the sound of her firing pattern registered. These weren't the tentative shots of someone unfamiliar with the weapon, nor the hurried bursts of a weekend hobbyist. Each report was spaced with intention, the cadence of someone trained to shoot under pressure. The crisp, controlled sound of her shots stood out, a subtle but unmistakable sign of mastery. Even the range instructor, mid-sentence with a junior Marine, paused to watch. He'd seen expert marksmen before, But the precision on display here went beyond the usual standard 7, those set by military snipers. At 200 meters, the target told its own story. When the range safety officer reeled it in, 5 rounds had punched through nearly the same hole, leaving a ragged cluster barely larger than a dime. A lance corporal inspecting targets blinked in disbelief, then glanced back up the line, searching for the shooter responsible. Riley reloaded with seamless efficiency, no hesitation, just fluid motion. Her hands found the magazine release and the new mag without breaking rhythm. She didn't pause to check her sights again, or adjust her stance. The staff sergeant who had been watching earlier edged closer, coffee cooling in his grip as he studied her posture, the way her arms and shoulders worked in concert, stabilizing the rifle without excess tension. Nearby, a corporal who had just finished boasting about his own marksmanship stopped to watch her next string of shots. His own grouping was respectable, but the precision Riley achieved was something else entirely. As her second volley echoed across the range, he turned fully to observe, recognizing that this wasn't just competition-level accuracy. It was the kind of skill that came from sniper training and real-world experience. The instructor marked her target with a grease pencil, circling the single ragged hole where all 5 rounds had passed through. He held it up for the safety officer to see, before attaching it to the rack behind Riley's lane. Conversations dropped to a hush as the Marines tried to process what they were seeing. The question lingered. How did a civilian gunsmith shoot like someone who'd spent years in special operations? Riley lowered the rifle and cleared it with the same quiet efficiency, her focus unwavering. She removed her ear protection, resting the weapon against the bench. The staff sergeant finally spoke, his tone shifting from skepticism to genuine curiosity. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" She gave a slight shrug. "Around." Her answer was simple, almost dismissive, but it left no room for further questions. The Marines around her exchanged uneasy glances, the silence stretching as they tried to reconcile what they'd witnessed with the story her paperwork told. Just then, a gunnery sergeant who'd been watching from the tower started making his way down the line, his steps slow and deliberate. The tension in the air grew, the Marines bracing for whatever came next, their doubts and whispered theories ready to spill into the open. A few Marines exchanged glances, the skepticism in their voices barely concealed. "Just another civilian playing dress-up," a private scoffed, his words drawing a ripple of laughter from those who still clung to their assumptions. The joke spread quickly. Someone suggested she was a military groupie, here for a photo op. Another claimed she was probably some celebrity social media star who'd lucked into a day at the range. Their explanations grew more creative as Riley continued to shoot anything to avoid admitting what they'd just seen. The younger Marines clustered together, each theory more far-fetched than the last. "Maybe she's the daughter of some general," one muttered, while another guessed she must be a private security trainer, here on a favor. The idea that a civilian could outshoot them was too much to accept. In their minds, there had to be an Anglia trick, a story, a connection that made it all make sense. Even as the evidence mounted with every controlled volley, they searched for reasons that fit their worldview. A gunny leaned forward, watching Riley's next string of fire. "That's not competition shooting, that's combat effective," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The range officer beside him glanced over, the skepticism on his face slowly giving way to doubt, as Riley executed a tactical reload without a hitch. The chatter along the line faded as more Marines turned to watch, their initial dismissiveness eroding with each precise movement. A staff sergeant stopped behind Riley, close enough to catch the technical details in her form. He noted how her hands moved, never lingering, never searching for a control. Her left thumb rested along the handguard, in a way he'd only seen from those who'd trained for situations where mistakes meant casualties. The staff sergeant's expression shifted, the easy confidence replaced by something more cautious. Across the range, the speculation continued, but the tone had changed. The jokes were quieter now, the glances sharper. Some whispered about police snipers, others insisted she had to be military. Yet none of their theories accounted for the small, unconscious habits that marked Riley as something else. Entirely habits that didn't come from civilian life or weekend drills. The gunny moved closer, posture straight, eyes narrowed as he took in the scars along Riley's forearms and the way she handled her weapon. He didn't speak, but the shift in his attention was obvious. Riley finished her relay, wiped down the rifle, and stepped back as the rangemaster called for the next group. Conversations resumed, but the edge was gone from the laughter. The explanations they'd clung to no longer held up. Marines who dismissed her a moment before now watched with a different kind of interest, their skepticism mixed with a grudging respect. As Riley walked away from the firing line, the atmosphere had changed. The crowd parted, and for the first time, no one tried to make a joke at her expense. Instead, eyes followed her movements, and the murmur of voices hinted at a new question that none of them wanted to say out loud. The challenge, when it came, would not be a joke. A corporal with 3 combat deployments stepped forward, breaking from the silent crowd around Riley's lane. He held out a magazine, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Try something with a little more edge," he said. The magazine was loaded with alternating tracer rounds each. One would alter recoil and add a layer of operational realism to the drill. It was a subtle challenge, a way to see if she'd falter when the environment stopped being predictable. Riley accepted the magazine without a word. She checked the rounds by touch, confirming the load and count, then seated it with a motion that was second nature. The Marines nearby watched more openly now, their skepticism shifting to a sharper curiosity. This wasn't standard marksmanship anymore. The test had changed. The corporal gestured at the target. "Mozambique drill," he said, keeping his voice casual. Known in special ops circles, this drill called for 2 shots to center mass, then 1 to the head, executed under time pressure. It was a drill that separated amateurs from professionals, designed to expose hesitation and test muscle memory under stress. Riley brought the rifle up and settled into a stance that shifted almost imperceptibly. The first 2 shots snapped out, the tracers streaking into the target's chest. Before the second flare had faded, she was already transitioning. The third shot cracked out, hitting the head box cleanly. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, deliberate, practiced, and free of wasted movement. She didn't flinch or pause to recalculate. These were drills she'd learned in live combat, not on a training course. The corporal's confidence faded as he studied the target. The scorch marks from the tracers formed a perfect trianglet woe, clustered at center mass, one precisely above. There were no stray holes, no need for correction, just 3 rounds placed exactly where they needed to be. A master gunnery sergeant moved in from the observation area, coffee forgotten in his hand. "Again," he said, but this time he pointed to a silhouette downrange, half hidden behind a barrel. The challenge was clear, same drill, but now with an offset angle and partial cover. Riley cycled the bolt, waited for the whistle, and sidestepped to acquire the new target. 2 rounds to the body, 1 to the head, each tracer landing in the critical zones despite the change in angle and visibility. She reloaded, the magazine snapping into place with practiced certainty. The gunnery sergeant's expression tightened. He'd seen this kind of proficiency before, but only in those who had spent years training under live fire. The added stress of tracer rounds hadn't thrown her timing or accuracy. She adapted without hesitation, her movements shaped by repetition most Marines never reached. The corporal who'd issued the challenge stood back, his bravado gone. Riley handed off the rifle, her jacket sleeve riding up as she extended her arm. The range had grown quieter, the Marines now watching with a new kind of respect, a recognition of skill that couldn't be explained away by luck or circumstance. As Riley moved to collect her gear, the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. The Marines gave her space, their earlier skepticism replaced by something more reserved. In the lingering silence, small details began to draw new attention. Riley reached for a fresh magazine, and as she did, the cuff of her jacket caught on the edge of the rifle's selector switch. The sleeve slid up, baring her wrist to the midday light. Faded ink, A seal trident overlaid with the number 9 stood out against her skin. Thin scars ran parallel to the ink marks only earned through Team 9's brutal trials, the kind of tactical supports that left their own signature on those who survived them. The tattoo's edges had softened with time, but the meaning hadn't faded at all. The gunnery sergeant closest to her froze as his coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered against the concrete. The sharp sound cut through the range's background noise, and all eyes turned. His gaze locked on Riley's wrist, recognition immediate and absolute. That trident alone signaled missions no one was cleared to discuss. Only a handful of people had ever seen that insignia up close, and fewer still had lived to remember it. Conversations died mid-sentence, as the realization spread down the firing line. Marines who had been whispering about lucky shots or civilian luck now stared in stunned silence. The corporal who'd issued the challenge took a step back, his posture shifting from competitive to cautious. The staff sergeant who'd been monitoring the line from the tower moved quickly, his expression sharpening as he registered the tattoo and the scars crossing it. Riley didn't acknowledge the sudden attention. She simply tugged her sleeve down and continued her reload, methodical and precise. The shift in the air was immediate. The jokes and dismissive remarks vanished, replaced with a new kind of respect tone born not of rank, but of reputation. The Marines around her saw the scars and the ink, and they understood. Those marks weren't just from service, but from something deeper, something that belonged to the shadows of their own world. A female Marine who'd been skeptical earlier now stood motionless, her face pale. She'd heard rumors about a woman with the call sign Ghost, stories traded in low voices at the end of long days. Most believed those stories were exaggerations, tales meant to inspire or intimidate. But seeing the tattoo in person, the reality settled in. The staff sergeant who approached Riley didn't need to ask questions. The details on her wrist answered all of them. The intersecting scars spoke of missions where extraction wasn't guaranteed, and the only thing left at the end was proof you'd been there at all. Even the younger Marines, who didn't yet grasp the full history, recognized the shift. They saw how the older NCOs straightened, how the tone of the range changed. The quiet woman they dismissed as a civilian was someone whose reputation reached far beyond paperwork and rumor. As Riley finished clearing her weapon and handed it off to the armorer, the silence on the range deepened. The respect was no longer just professional, it was personal. Eyes followed her, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. The tattoo had revealed what words never could. At the edge of the range, a senior officer finally moved, his attention fixed on Riley's wrist. The Marines waited, the air charged with a new understanding as the next moment began to unfold. Commander Blake Harrison had kept to the observation deck for most of the morning, his focus sharpening with each of Riley's reloads. When her sleeve slipped and the faded SEAL Team 9 tattoo came into view, he set his coffee aside, posture shifting with sudden intent. He moved down the metal stairs, boots hitting each step with a measured pace, and the Marines closest to the railing stepped back, uncertain but instinctively aware something important was happening. Harrison's attention never left Riley as he crossed the range, closing the distance to Lane 7. Riley was midway through field stripping the M4, her hands steady, her focus undisturbed by the sudden hush that had fallen. Harrison stopped a few paces from her, his presence commanding but quiet. He didn't use the clipped authority reserved for orders, or the casual tone of small talk. There was a different weight to how he addressed her. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but carrying. The staff sergeant nearby straightened, recognizing the respect behind the word. Riley paused, just for a moment, and glanced up. There was no salute, no need for ceremony between them. Harrison's hand hovered at his own wrist, where a different insignia lay hidden beneath his sleeve. The Marines who watched from behind the barricades registered the subtle shift in power. They'd seen their commander handle high-ranking officers and visiting dignitaries with ease, but this quiet acknowledgement unsettled them. The woman they dismissed as a civilian now drew a level of respect that didn't fit any of their assumptions. "You don't see this every day," Harrison said, his words meant for everyone within earshot. You've just stood beside someone who earned her SEAL trident at the highest level. He let the statement hang, his gaze sweeping the line of Marines. There are things in this world that don't make it into the manuals. Some of you will spend your whole careers without meeting someone who's carried what she has. The room seemed to shrink around his words. A private shifted, uncertain, but Harrison didn't break his gaze. That mark isn't a souvenir. It's a record of missions no one will ever talk about, of choices no one wants to make. He didn't mention the details, but the message was clear. Riley's discharge hadn't come from failure or scandal. She'd been forced out because her success had become politically inconvenient, her story too complicated for the neat boxes of official reports. Riley finished reassembling the rifle, each part clicking into place with practiced ease. She handed it to the armorer, nodded once, and gathered her gear. Harrison stepped aside without another word, his expression unreadable. The Marines who doubted her now watched every movement, noticing the way she carried her kit, the scars along her knuckles, the calm in her steps, details that suddenly felt significant. No one spoke as she crossed the concrete floor. The jokes and whispered doubts had faded, replaced by a quiet that felt almost reverent. Near the exit, a gunnery sergeant straightened in silent acknowledgement, a gesture that needed no words. Riley didn't pause or look back. She moved through the open doors, leaving the range in a silence that lingered long after she was gone. Stories began to circulate almost as soon as Riley disappeared from sight. Marines gathered in small groups, replaying every detail, the way she'd field-stripped the rifle in seconds, the subtle scan of each corner before she moved, the way her stance never faltered. Senior NCOs compared notes, recalling how her movements mirrored those of instructors who'd spent years in the field. It didn't take long before someone mentioned that even the base's most respected marksmanship trainers had requested transfers just to observe her technique up close. The realization settled in. They hadn't just witnessed skill, but a level of ingrained discipline that only came from the highest tiers of special operations. Near the targets, a corporal lingered, eyes fixed on the silhouette Riley had used. The grouping at 200 meters was tighter than anything he'd managed in his own qualifications. He studied the paper, running his finger over the ragged hole left by her shots, then glanced at the other targets, each one marked with the same precision. Without a word, he folded the sheet and tucked it away, a quiet keepsake from a day that would be retold for months. At the armory counter, the gunnery sergeant who'd dropped his coffee earlier stood in silence, replaying the moment when the tattoo had come into view. He recognized the faded ink and the parallel scars marks that only came from years in salt water and the kind of training that left more than just physical reminders. The memory brought back stories he'd heard in whispers about Team 9 and the people who'd survived its trials. He didn't need to say anything. The respect was obvious in the way he stood a little straighter and spoke a little softer to those around him. Clusters of junior Marines gathered near the bleachers, their voices low. Some argued about the Mozambique drill, others about the impossible reload speed. Their staff sergeant listened, then cut through their speculation with a few quiet words reminding them that what they'd seen wasn't luck or showmanship, but the product of a life lived at the edge of what most could imagine. The lesson didn't need to be spelled out. By evening, word had spread well beyond the range. Marines who hadn't witnessed the events firsthand asked to see the targets, while those who had seemed changed quieter, more deliberate in their routines. A few noticed a new plaque that had appeared near the entrance, placed there without ceremony. It bore no name, just a simple emblem and a datea, silent nod to the kind of service that rarely made it into official records. The range, for all its routine, felt different. The usual banter faded, replaced by a sense of careful attention. Rifles were cleaned with more focus, gear checked twice instead of once. The Marines carried themselves with a new awareness, shaped by a story that would be retold long after the day was done. And in that shift, a quiet respect took root, changing the way they saw their work and each other. After Riley's tattoo was revealed, the range settled into a subdued routine. The Marines who had crowded her lane earlier now kept their distance, their conversations replaced by a quiet focus. Riley continued moving through her drills with the same steady rhythm, checking chambers, swapping magazines, and scanning her surroundings with a calm that didn't waver, even as every eye tracked her movements. At the ammunition table, a staff sergeant watched Riley shift her weight as she reset for another round. He noticed the subtle way she favored her left leg, the kind of adjustment that spoke of an old injury, not just fatigue. It was a detail he'd seen before in veterans who had pushed through wounds that never fully healed. The recognition was immediate and unspoken. He nudged a corporal beside him, who started to comment but stopped short when Riley's gaze flicked over, sharp and aware. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone was enough to quiet the line. Commander Harrison had returned to the observation deck, but he no longer pretended to review paperwork. His attention stayed fixed on Riley as she methodically ran through a series of tactical checks magazine changes under simulated stress, malfunction drills, and rapid transitions between targets. Each motion was precise, practiced, and unhurried. The Marines nearby noted how she worked through each step without visible tension, her composure unbroken by the scrutiny or the pressure of being watched by a crowd that now understood just who was in their midst. By midday, the armorers stopped tracking the rifles Riley cycled through. Each weapon came back cleaner than when it was issued, bolts gliding smoothly, feed lips checked by touch. The young private at the counter stopped trying to make small talk, instead observing the way she handled every piece of equipment as if it might save her life. The lesson was clear in her habits, and the Marines took notice. Downrange, the targets bore silent testimony to her skill. Tight groupings, alternating center mass and headshots, formed patterns recognized by anyone who'd studied advanced marksmanship. A captain paused at one silhouette, tracing the diagonal line of Hitsa method designed to defeat body armor and end a threat decisively. He said nothing, but the look he exchanged with the range instructor made the message clear. When the last relay finished, the Marines packed up in near silence. There were no jokes, no boasts, just a quiet efficiency that hadn't been there before. Riley gathered her gear, jacket sleeve pulled down over her wrist, and left the range without ceremony. At the armory, a single spent casing appeared on the counter, a small, silent tribute from the Marines who'd witnessed something they would never forget. The range would open again the next day, but the atmosphere had changed. The Marines left with a new sense of quiet confidence, shaped by what they'd seen. As the sun dipped lower, the memory of Riley's presence lingered, and the day's lessons settled in, unspoken but understood. As Riley Shaw left the range, her presence lingered in the way Marines now stood and moved quieter, more deliberate. The trident on her wrist belonged to SEAL Team 9, the Ghost Squadron, whose missions remained classified, whose sacrifices were rarely recognized outside their own ranks. Those who had doubted her now understood that some legacies are carried in silence, marked not by medals but by scars, and the respect of those who recognize what they mean. Riley's story challenges us to look beyond appearances and honor the invisible legends who walk among us. True service isn't always celebrated in public, and the greatest acts of courage often go unseen. If you know someone whose contributions deserve recognition, share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more unseen stories of service and sacrifice.